Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at American politics
Okay.
through the lens of Tulsi Gabbard's new book,
All right.
For Love of Country.
Yeah.
So you might remember her from her time in Congress or even her presidential run.
Yeah.
This book is really interesting. It's
Yeah.
a mix of memoir
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
her take on where America is and where we're going.
I
And
see.
let me tell you, she doesn't hold back.
Oh, really?
There's some really spicy opinions in this book.
Well, I mean, that's what we're here for, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or spicy takes.
That's what we're deep diving into. So
Yeah.
let's jump right in.
Okay.
One of the most thought-provoking arguments that she makes is this idea of a democratic elite.
Okay.
She's not the first person to use that term.
Right.
But she offers some pretty specific examples of how this group operates and who they are.
I see.
So what's your take on that? This whole democratic elite idea. Well, I think what's fascinating here is how she connects this to a fear of the average American voter.
Okay.
You know, she argues that this elite group is more concerned with holding on to their power than actually representing the people that they're supposed to serve.
So they're kind of afraid of the voters, almost.
Yeah, they're afraid that if left to their own devices, voters might make quote-unquote wrong choices.
Yeah.
And so they try to control the narrative, control the information that people have access to.
I see. So almost manipulate them?
Yeah, and even manipulate voters.
Wow. That's a pretty
bold claim.
bold claim. Yeah.
Yeah.
She even compares some of their tactics to stuff that you would see in a dictatorship, like limiting
Right.
access to information, censorship, things like that.
Yeah, it's a thought-provoking comparison, and she backs it up with specific examples.
Okay.
You know, you might remember all the talk about the Russia collusion narrative surrounding Donald Trump during his presidency.
Vaguely.
Well, she goes all in on debunking that. What she calls the big hoax.
Okay, so remind me here.
Okay.
What exactly is the big hoax?
So the big hoax
Yeah.
centers around this document called the Steele dossier.
Okay.
Do you remember that?
Vaguely. Yeah.
Okay, so that dossier was this collection of allegations
Right.
about Trump and his ties to Russia.
Okay.
And Gabbard argues that it was essentially a fabricated document
Yeah.
that was used to push this narrative of collusion and undermine his presidency.
I see.
And she doesn't just point fingers at political opponents.
Okay.
She's also very critical of the media's role in all this.
So the media was kind of complicit in this, in her view.
Yeah, she's basically saying the media was a mouthpiece for this manufactured narrative
Okay.
and didn't really hold anyone accountable for creating it.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's a pretty serious accusation.
it is. And it's part of this bigger point that she makes about what she calls fake news.
Okay.
And she's really concerned about how easily false information can spread and be used to manipulate public opinion.
Yeah.
I mean, you've probably seen this yourself with all the misinformation
Oh, absolutely. It's everywhere,
floating around online.
especially online.
Yeah, it's like everyone has their own version of the truth these days.
It really does feel like that.
It's pretty crazy.
So she doesn't stop there, right?
No, she doesn't.
She also talks about this like kind of shadowy,
Right.
deep state.
Yes,
That's kind of
that's the term she uses.
pulling the strings behind the scenes.
Right.
So what's her take on that?
So she argues that there are certain active and retired officials
Okay.
from the Justice Department
Mhm.
and national security agencies who are involved in planting fake news
Wow.
and manipulating public perception.
Okay.
And she brings up examples like, you know, the lack of consequences
Right.
for those involved with the Steele dossier,
Yeah.
even after it's discredited.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So it's not just a one-off thing. This is like a pattern of behavior
Yeah, it's a pattern.
in her view.
And she claims this isn't just a Trump-era thing.
Okay.
She argues that both the Obama and Biden administrations have engaged in similar tactics,
I see.
targeting political opponents to silence dissent.
Okay, so give me an example. How did the Obama administration do this?
Well, she points to the IRS targeting of conservative groups during the Obama administration.
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember that?
I vaguely remember that.
Okay, so groups with Patriot or Tea Party in their name were supposedly singled out
Yeah.
for extra scrutiny by the IRS.
Wow. Okay, but how does she tie that to this idea of like weaponizing the national security state?
Well, she sees it as part of a pattern.
Okay.
She argues that when those in power feel threatened,
Right.
they sometimes resort to tactics that violate basic rights. And she even makes a comparison to the Japanese internment camps during World War II.
Okay, hold on.
Yeah.
She's comparing this to Japanese internment.
She's drawing a parallel
Okay.
between the fear-mongering and demonization that led to internment
Okay.
and what she sees happening today.
Okay, I see. Yeah.
So she's concerned about labeling certain groups as quote-unquote domestic terrorists
Yeah.
and using surveillance to target political opponents.
So she's not saying it's on the same level as Japanese internment, but it's like
Right. Not the same level, but
what same kind of thinking?
the same kind of thinking. Yeah.
That's really scary.
It is concerning, yeah.
She also talks a lot about the Patriot Act, right?
Yes, she does.
That was the law passed after 9/11
Right.
that expanded the government's surveillance powers.
Right.
And I mean, obviously that was a really scary time for everybody.
Of course.
But she's saying that it went too far.
She argues that it's been used to justify overreach,
Right.
violating the Fourth Amendment, which protects against unreasonable searches and seizures.
Okay, so remind me, what was Edward Snowden's role in all of this?
Right. So Snowden's revelations about mass surveillance really shook things up.
Yeah.
And Gabbard connects that back to the Patriot Act.
Okay.
And even draws a comparison to the Pentagon Papers.
So for those who don't know, the Pentagon Papers were...
Yeah, so those were classified documents that
Right.
were leaked to the press during the Vietnam War.
Right, and they showed that the government was misleading the public
Exactly.
about the war.
Exactly.
So that was a huge scandal.
Huge.
Okay, so she's saying there are parallels there.
Yes, she's suggesting that we're seeing a similar pattern today with the erosion of civil liberties in the name of national security.
Right.
And her argument is that the Patriot Act, which was supposed to be a temporary measure,
Yeah.
has been repeatedly reauthorized with little debate or scrutiny.
I see.
And that this shows how those in power are more concerned with holding on to their authority
Right.
than protecting the rights of citizens.
Wow, so she's basically saying that the government has been given a blank check
Yeah.
to spy on its own people.
That's her argument.
Wow.
And she backs it up with some pretty specific examples. Like the FISA court process, which she says lacks transparency
Right.
and allows the government to spy on Americans without proper oversight.
It's kind of scary to think about.
It is, isn't it?
That the government could be watching us,
Yeah.
listening to us without us knowing.
Exactly. And she brings up former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper,
Oh, yeah.
who lied under oath about the NSA collecting data on millions of Americans.
Remember that whole thing.
Yeah, Snowden's leaks exposed that whole thing.
Yeah.
And she sees that as a prime example of the government overstepping its bounds.
Right.
And then trying to cover it up.
Yeah, like they think they're above the law almost.
Right. She's concerned about a culture of deception and a lack of accountability within the intelligence community.
That's really worrying.
Yeah, it is.
And it's not just about the government, right?
Right.
She also criticizes the Obama administration's pursuit of journalists
Yes.
who published leaked information.
Right.
So she's drawing a connection there to Julian Assange.
Yes, and the Espionage Act charges brought against him.
Okay, so she's saying that the government is using the Espionage Act,
Yeah,
which was intended to punish spies,
right.
to silence people who are exposing wrongdoing.
Exactly. It raises the question of whether national security is being used as an excuse
Right?
to silence critics
Yeah.
and suppress information that the government doesn't want the public to know.
And her military background really gives her perspective a lot of weight here.
Absolutely. She's seen firsthand
Yeah.
how national security concerns can be used to justify all sorts of things.
So her warnings should be taken seriously.
They should, yeah.
But it's not just about national security, though, is it?
No, it's not.
She also gets into this whole debate about the border crisis.
That's right.
So what's her take on that?
She criticizes both the Obama and Biden administrations for what she sees as their failure to secure the border and enforce immigration laws.
Okay.
And she connects this to her argument about the Democratic elite, claiming that they're using open border policies for political gain,
Okay.
even if it harms everyday Americans.
So they're putting their own interests
Right.
ahead of the country's.
That's her take. And she even quotes Democrat Representative Yvette Clarke,
Oh, wow.
who openly said she wants more people in her district for redistricting purposes.
So for a political gain?
Yeah, meaning to gain more political power.
Wow.
And Gabbard uses this to argue that the Democratic elite is willing to overlook the negative consequences of open borders,
Okay.
like the strain on resources and the increase in crime,
Right.
as long as it helps them politically.
That's a pretty cynical view.
It is, yeah.
But I can see how she arrived there.
Yeah.
She also takes issue with what she sees as a tendency to downplay violence and crime in Democrat-led cities.
Right.
Particularly this defund the police movement.
Yes.
That was a big thing
Really?
a few years ago.
Yeah.
So she's arguing that this is a dangerous policy.
She argues that it's led to more crime and less safety.
Okay.
And she draws on her own experience dealing with homelessness in Honolulu,
Right.
where she served on the city council,
Okay.
to illustrate this point.
I see.
She saw firsthand how policies aimed at accommodating homeless encampments actually backfired,
Okay.
leading to more crime
Right.
and a decline in quality of life for residents.
So she's saying that sometimes being tough on crime is actually the more compassionate approach.
That's her argument.
That's definitely a different perspective than what we usually hear.
It is, yeah.
She kind of contrasts this with what she calls the,
Yeah.
woke ideology,
All right, a woke ideology.
which she sees as being out of touch with the realities of crime
Right.
and the needs of everyday people.
Exactly.
So it's focused on these,
Yeah.
microaggressions and stuff.
Right. Perceived offensive.
Yeah.
Microaggressions.
Well, that's downplaying actual violence.
Exactly. And she uses a New York Times op-ed by Maria Makaba as an example, who advocates for abolishing the police.
Wow.
And Gabbard sees this as extreme and unrealistic,
Right.
ignoring the need for law enforcement to maintain order.
So it's kind of like a naive
Yeah.
worldview.
A naive worldview, yeah.
Okay. And she also criticizes this,
Yeah.
rhetoric around policing, where it's constantly
Ah.
demonizing police officers and accusing them of systemic racism.
Exactly. And
Right.
she believes that this rhetoric is harmful and divisive.
Okay. And here she brings in her own personal experience.
Right.
She talks about how much respect she has for law enforcement based on her time serving alongside police officers in the military. And her sister's experience as a deputy U.S. Marshal.
Right.
So she's trying to humanize the issue a little bit.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
From the Democratic elite to fake news to the weaponization of the national security state. Gabbard doesn't shy away from controversial topics.
Not at all.
That's for sure.
And we've only just scratched the surface.
Oh, really? There's more?
Yeah.
Oh, boy.
She goes on to discuss freedom of speech,
Oh, great.
the war in Ukraine,
Okay.
and what she sees as a spiritual crisis in America.
Oh, wow.
So buckle up, because there's a lot more to unpack.
I am ready. Let's do this.
Okay. It's wild how she uses these historical examples to make her points,
Yeah.
bringing up Japanese internment camps during World War II, really.
To show how easily...
To show how easily
Fear and prejudice?
fear and prejudice can be used to justify violating basic rights.
Civil liberties.
Exactly. And she points out,
Yeah.
over 120,000 Japanese Americans,
Wow.
many of them U.S. citizens,
Right.
were stripped of their rights, imprisoned,
Just
without any real evidence
into Japanese.
of wrongdoing,
Yeah.
just because of their heritage.
Crazy.
And she even,
It's how could you do that?
of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team,
Right.
composed almost entirely of Japanese-American soldiers.
Yeah.
These guys fought with distinction in Europe,
Yeah.
became one of the most decorated units in U.S. military history.
Crazy.
Right. And it just makes you think,
Wow. Yeah.
how easily
we can just
we can fall prey to fear and prejudice,
Yeah.
even when it goes against our values.
It's kind of a human flaw.
It is. It's a human flaw.
But anyway, so she's saying that we're seeing echoes of that today.
She is. She argues that we're seeing echoes of that same kind of fear-mongering
Right.
and demonization today.
Wait.
She points to the labeling of certain groups as domestic terrorists
Right.
and the use of surveillance
Yeah.
to target political opponents.
Yeah. That's pretty scary.
It is sobering,
Yeah.
for sure.
One of the things that really stood out to me was her discussion of freedom of speech.
Okay. Yeah.
So, she argues that it's under attack from both sides, government censorship and what she calls woke cancel culture.
It's a fascinating point.
Yeah.
She sees it as this two-pronged assault
Right.
on our First Amendment rights.
Yeah.
On one hand, you have the government trying to control the narrative,
Right.
silence dissenting voices.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, you have this sort of social pressure to conform to a specific ideology or risk being ostracized,
Yeah.
losing your job, whatever it is.
Yeah, you can't even speak your mind.
Yeah.
without fear of being,
Without fear of reprisal.
yeah, canceled or whatever.
Right.
And she even shares her own experience with this.
She does.
She says that Google was filtering her campaign emails,
Really?
sending them to spam folders
Wow.
during the 2020 presidential run.
Hey, imagine that. You're running for president,
Yeah.
and big tech is messing with your ability to communicate with voters.
It's crazy, right?
It raises some serious concerns about the power of these tech giants
Right.
and their potential to influence elections.
And she
Well,
actually...
she even points to a study
Oh, wow.
that found Gmail was more likely to filter out emails from Republican candidates
Oh, really?
than Democrats.
Okay.
So that's kind of interesting.
Wow, and she even sued Google over this.
Yeah, and she lost the case, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's like, how do you even fight that?
It's tricky, right? How do you regulate these powerful companies
Yeah.
without infringing on free speech?
Yeah. That's tough.
Yeah, it's a question a lot of people are grappling with.
It's a tough one. And she doesn't stop with big tech.
No.
She also criticizes the ACLU, which she believes has abandoned its commitment to free speech.
She does. She's very critical of it.
And she's not the only one who's saying that.
No, a lot of people are saying that.
It seems like they're picking and choosing which viewpoints to defend.
Right. It's less about free speech these days.
Yeah.
And more about, defending certain ideologies.
Right, which kind of goes against the whole point of free speech. She brings up the controversy surrounding Abigail Shrier's book, Irreversible Damage.
Oh, yeah.
Which explores the potential harms of the transgender movement.
Right. Very controversial.
So when a professor at UC Berkeley urged her followers to, steal and burn copies of this book,
wow,
the ACLU, instead of defending the author's right to publish,
right,
actually opposed the book
okay.
and its ideas.
So they took sides.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Wow. So that's kind of a stark example of how
yeah,
even organizations that were once seen as champions of free speech
right,
are now taking sides.
Taking sides in these culture wars.
It's crazy.
It is.
It's kind of a disturbing trend.
It is a concerning trend.
Speaking of controversial topics, she also gets into the Hunter Biden laptop controversy.
Okay, yeah.
And how it was handled during the 2020 election.
Right, and she doesn't hold back there.
So what's her take?
Well, she basically accuses the Biden campaign of spreading disinformation about the laptop's contents.
Okay.
Calling it Russian propaganda.
Wow.
To protect Joe Biden from potentially damaging information.
And she has some evidence to back this up.
She does.
Okay.
She cites testimony from former acting CIA director Mike Morrell.
Okay.
Who admitted to coordinating with the Biden campaign.
Wow.
To discredit the laptop story.
So it's not just her opinion. This is based on,
based on evidence, yeah.
Actual facts.
Yeah.
That's pretty serious.
It is. It speaks to her broader concern about the politicization of the intelligence community.
Like they're not supposed to be.
Right. They're supposed to be neutral, nonpartisan.
Yeah.
But she's arguing that they're not.
That they're being used for political purposes.
That's right.
Which is scary.
It is scary. And she argues that the government, the media, and big tech.
Wow. All of them.
All work together to suppress the story.
Oh, wow.
And prevent it from influencing the election.
And so this is a direct attack on democracy in her view.
It is. She even asks, if we can't even access information freely, how can we make informed decisions as voters?
That's a good question.
It is a good question, and it raises these really important questions about the influence of these institutions.
Right, yeah.
And their potential to manipulate public opinion.
Yeah. And she ties this back to the Patriot Act.
She does.
And the FISA courts.
Right. Saying these tools have been used to silence dissent.
Right.
And justify government overreach.
In the name
of national security.
Yeah, it's really disturbing.
It is disturbing. It makes you wonder how much of what we see and hear
how much of it is actually true.
Is actually the truth.
Yeah.
And how much of it's being filtered or manipulated by those in power.
It's like, who do you even trust anymore?
Right. It's hard to know.
Yeah.
And this leads her into this critique of what she calls the war uniparty. This idea that both Democrats and Republicans are complicit in perpetuating endless conflict for their own benefit.
Like they both benefit from war.
Exactly. And she brings up President Eisenhower's famous warning about the military-industrial complex.
Oh, yeah.
Arguing that it's become too powerful and influential, pushing our country into unnecessary wars.
I see.
And she specifically cites the wars in Iraq, Libya, and Syria as examples.
Okay.
Arguing that these interventions were based on false pretenses destabilized the region, and ultimately made America less safe. She's especially critical of the intervention in Libya, saying it led to the country's collapse and the rise of slave trading.
Wow, that's pretty intense.
It is.
And she also criticizes the media for promoting a pro-war narrative.
Right. And demonizing anyone who questions military intervention.
So it's like this whole system.
It is. It's like this whole ecosystem that benefits from war.
Yeah.
The defense contractors,
Yeah.
the politicians, the media.
And if you speak out against it,
You're unpatriotic, you're weak,
Yeah.
you're whatever.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And she doesn't just talk about this in the abstract, you know. She shares some very personal and heartbreaking stories from her own deployment to Iraq, including the death of one of her soldiers.
Oh, wow.
And these stories are really powerful. They bring home the human cost of war
Right.
in a way that statistics never can.
I see.
It's a reminder that behind every policy decision, there are real lives at stake.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that sometimes.
It is. It's easy to get caught up in the abstract.
The big picture.
Right, but she brings it back down to earth.
To the human level.
To the human level.
Yeah. So she describes what it was like to see her fellow soldiers killed and wounded.
Yeah.
And the emotional toll it took on her and her unit.
And she paints this very vivid picture of the memorial service for one of her soldiers, a young man named Frank Tye.
Oh, wow.
And it was clear that these experiences had a profound impact on her.
Yeah.
And shaped her views on war and peace.
So she's not just talking about this from an intellectual standpoint.
No, this is personal for us.
This is like...
This comes from her gut.
Yeah, from her experience.
Her experience, yeah.
Wow. And this brings us to her critique of the current conflict in Ukraine.
Right, which is probably what she's most known for right now.
Yeah, she's been very outspoken in her opposition.
Very outspoken.
To the Biden administration's handling of the war.
Right.
So what's her main criticism there?
Well, she argues that they're recklessly pursuing a new Cold War that could lead to nuclear annihilation.
Wow, she's not pulling any punches.
No, she's not.
She even compares the current situation to the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right, which
is terrifying.
Terrifying, the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war.
Yeah, and she's basically saying that we're sleepwalking into a similar situation.
Yeah, she's urging caution in diplomacy.
Okay.
Arguing that the Biden administration is too focused on weakening Russia.
Right.
And not focused enough on finding a peaceful resolution.
I see.
And she points to the fact that 30 Democrats in Congress initially signed a letter urging Biden to pursue a negotiated settlement.
Right.
But then retracted it.
Oh, wow.
After facing pressure from party leaders.
So they were kind of silenced?
Yeah, it makes you wonder if there's even room for dissenting voices.
Within the party.
Within the Democratic Party when it comes to foreign policy.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's concerning.
And you know, this is where her story about the false missile alert in Hawaii becomes especially chilling.
Oh, yeah.
So she describes how people were frantically searching for shelter.
Dropping their kids into manholes.
Yeah.
Thinking they were about to be obliterated.
Yeah, just the panic.
The panic is palpable in her telling of the story.
And she had to confirm with officials that it was a false alarm.
Right.
And then tweet out the information.
Frantically trying to get the word out.
Let people know they weren't about to die.
Right, because nobody else was doing it.
Yeah, it's just crazy.
It just shows you how real the threat of nuclear war is.
Yeah.
And how easily a simple mistake could lead to unimaginable consequences.
Yeah, and we're not really talking about this enough.
We're not, and she argues that we're not having a serious enough conversation about this threat.
Yeah.
Especially given the escalating tensions with Russia and China.
Yeah, it's like we're just pretending it's not a thing.
Right, we're just burying our heads in the sand.
But it's a real threat.
It is a real threat.
And it could happen at any moment.
It could. And she criticizes the lack of attention given to nuclear war during the 2020 presidential campaign.
Nobody talked about it.
No, it was barely even mentioned.
Wow, that's pretty disturbing.
It is disturbing, and she says that her concerns were dismissed as an obsession.
Really?
By reporters and even some of her fellow candidates.
It's like they just didn't get it?
They didn't get it, or they didn't want to get it.
Yeah, it's easier to just ignore it.
Right, it's easier to pretend it's not a problem.
But anyway, even with all this criticism, she's not just doom and gloom.
No, she's not.
She also talks about, you know, the importance of service and leadership.
Right.
And how we can work together to create a better future.
That's right. She calls for a return to the principles that she believes made America great. Individual liberty.
Okay.
Limited government.
Yeah.
A commitment to the common good.
Okay.
And this is where she gets into what she sees as a spiritual crisis in America.
Okay, this is interesting.
Yeah.
So what does she mean by that?
Well, she argues that this crisis is rooted in a rejection of objective truth
Okay.
and a growing hostility toward faith.
Okay, so she's saying that we've lost our moral compass.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. We've lost our grounding.
Yeah.
And she's particularly critical of what she sees as the Democratic Party's embrace of identity politics
Okay.
and its attempts to erase religious freedom.
So she's not just criticizing Republicans, she's criticizing her own party.
She is. She's critical of both parties.
Wow, that's pretty brave.
It is. It's not easy to go against your own tribe,
Especially when you're a politician.
especially when you're a politician. Yeah.
So she contrasts this with the vision of America's founders
Right.
who believed that our rights come from God,
Right.
not from the government.
Not from the government, exactly.
And that's a point that's often forgotten.
It is.
These days, it's often forgotten.
It's all about, like,
Yeah.
what the government can give you.
Right. It's about entitlements.
Yeah.
It's about
Instead of, like, your inherent rights.
your inherent rights, exactly.
as a human being.
As a human being, yeah.
Okay. So she sees this spiritual crisis as being at the root of many of the problems
She does.
that we're facing as a country.
She does.
The division, the anger, the lack of civility
Right. It's like we've lost our ability
To even talk to each other.
to even talk to each other.
Yeah.
That's screaming and yelling.
Yeah, civil discourse is dead.
It feels that way sometimes.
Yeah. And she even talks about her own upbringing
Right.
in a multi-faith household,
Hmm.
blending Christianity and Hinduism.
Which is really interesting.
It's not something you hear a lot about.
Not from a politician, no.
No.
And how her opponent in her first congressional race
Oh, wow.
attacked her faith,
Really?
trying to paint her as unfit for office
Wow.
because of her beliefs.
That's terrible.
It's like, can you not just focus on the issues?
Not just debate the issues.
Yeah, instead of attacking someone's religion.
It's a reminder that religious intolerance can come from any side
Yeah.
of the political spectrum.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And she argues that this intolerance has become more prevalent
Okay.
within the Democratic Party in recent years.
Okay.
She points to the attacks on Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett
Oh, yeah.
during their Supreme Court confirmation hearings.
Those were brutal.
They were brutal, and she criticizes Senators Kamala Harris and Mazie Hirono
Yeah.
for questioning nominees about their membership in the Knights of Columbus,
Oh, yeah.
which is a Catholic fraternal organization.
Right. Like, what does that have to do with their ability to be a judge? It's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous, and she sees this as an attempt to impose a religious test
Which is
for public office,
against the Constitution.
which is unconstitutional.
Yeah, I remember those hearings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They were tough to watch.
Yeah, they were pretty rough.
Yeah, and she also brings up Senator Dianne Feinstein's comment
Okay.
to Amy Coney Barrett, "The dogma lives loudly within you."
Oh, yeah.
And Gabbard sees this as just blatant anti-Catholic bias.
Yeah, and it's surprising that there wasn't more outrage.
More outrage from the Democratic Party.
Yeah, if a Republican had said that about a Muslim nominee
Oh, yeah.
or a Jewish nominee,
Right. It would have been a huge scandal.
it would have been front page news.
Exactly. But because it was directed at a Catholic,
Right.
it was kind of swept under the rug.
So she's pointing out this double standard.
Exactly. A double standard.
Yeah, and she argues that this hypocrisy extends to the issue of religious freedom more broadly.
She does, and she points to the COVID-19 pandemic as an example,
Okay.
saying that many Democrat-led states and cities use the pandemic as an excuse to target churches
Right.
and restrict religious gatherings,
Okay.
while allowing secular businesses to remain open.
So another double standard.
Another double standard, yeah.
What are some examples of that?
Well, she brings up the church in Oregon that was allowed to hold exercise classes,
Okay.
but not church services.
Oh, wow.
And then there was the city in Mississippi
Right.
that banned drive-in church services
Yeah.
while allowing drive-in restaurants to operate.
That's crazy.
It's like they were just trying to find any excuse
to target church.
to target churches, exactly.
Yeah, it's pretty clear.
It's pretty clear.
And she criticizes the Biden administration's attempts to weaken religious freedom protections,
Yes.
arguing that they're trying to push a secular agenda that's hostile to people of faith.
Right.
And she contrasts this with the more tolerant
Right.
and inclusive approach to religion
Mm-hmm.
that she experienced growing up. So she talks about how her family embraced both Christian and Hindu traditions,
Right.
and how she never felt like she had to choose one religion over another.
It's a beautiful message
It is.
of unity and acceptance.
Yeah, it's kind of refreshing.
It is.
To hear that.
Especially in our current climate.
Yeah, where everything is so divisive.
So divisive.
And she also highlights a story
It is.
about the power of forgiveness after the tragic shooting at a church in Charleston, South Carolina,
Oh, yeah.
back in 2015.
Yeah, that was a horrific event.
It is awful.
A white supremacist murdered 9 black parishioners during a Bible study.
Yeah, it was just senseless violence.
Senseless.
But what's amazing is how the families of the victims responded.
Right, they publicly forgave the shooter.
Yeah, I can't even imagine.
It was an incredible act of grace and compassion
It really was.
in the face of such unimaginable grief.
Yeah, and she describes attending the memorial service
Mm.
for the victims
Yeah.
and being deeply moved by the spirit of love and forgiveness.
And she sees it as an example of how faith can heal even the deepest wounds
Yeah.
and bring people together in times of darkness.
Yeah, it's like,
It gives you hope
it does, yeah.
that even in the face of such tragedy,
Yeah.
there is still good in the world.
There's still hope.
There's still hope, yeah.
And, she doesn't just talk about religion in the abstract.
Right.
She also discusses how she joined Congressman Trey Gowdy
Okay.
in visiting historical sites related to the slave trade in Charleston.
Oh, wow.
So that must have been a very powerful and emotional experience.
Absolutely.
Especially in the context of the church shooting.
Right. It's a reminder
Yeah.
of the dark history of racism in America
Yeah.
and the importance of confronting that history, honestly
Yeah.
and truthfully.
And she kind of reflects on how the service at the church demonstrated the unifying power of God's love.
Yeah, transcending differences in race, politics, and background.
And she sees this as a model
Right.
for how we can heal the divisions in our country.
It's a message that's desperately needed
It is.
in our current political climate.
I see. So we need more of this.
More love, more forgiveness,
Yeah.
more understanding.
Yeah, and she also wades into the debate about transgender issues,
Okay.
focusing on the impact on women and girls.
Right. This is a hot button issue,
It is.
and her perspective is definitely controversial.
Yeah, and it's important to acknowledge that there are other perspectives out there.
Absolutely.
But she's raising concerns that a lot of people share.
She is.
And those concerns deserve to be heard.
They do. They do.
So she brings up the Leah Thomas controversy in swimming,
Oh, yeah.
where a transgender woman competed against and defeated biological women,
Right.
sparking a huge debate about fairness
Fairness and equality.
in sports.
Yeah.
So she focuses on this issue of transgender athletes competing in women's sports,
Mhm.
arguing that it creates an unfair advantage.
For male-bodied athletes
Right.
and undermines the progress that women have made in athletics.
Yeah, and she highlights the biological differences between men and women,
Right.
arguing that these differences can't just be erased.
Right. They're real.
Yeah.
They have real-world consequences.
By simply identifying as a different gender.
Right. It's not that simple.
She also criticizes the use of terms like birthing people and chest feeders,
Oh, yeah.
arguing that this language is dehumanizing to women
Right.
and erases their unique experiences and perspectives.
It's a fascinating linguistic point,
It is, yeah.
and it speaks to the broader debate
Yeah.
about the power of language to shape our understanding of the world.
It's like we're trying to erase women
Right.
from the language.
It's very Orwellian.
It is, yeah. And she brings up the story of Chloe Cole,
Okay.
a detransitioned woman who regrets undergoing gender transition procedures as a teenager.
Right.
So Chloe's story is kind of a cautionary tale
It is.
about the potential harms of rushing young people into medical interventions before they're fully able to understand the long-term consequences.
Exactly. And she criticizes what she sees as the hypocrisy of the Democratic Party on this issue.
Okay.
She argues that they claim to be champions of women's rights,
Right.
but are now undermining those rights by embracing policies that allow men to compete in women's sports.
Right. So it's like they're saying one thing
Yeah.
and doing another.
Exactly. And she ties this back to her larger point about the rejection of objective truth.
Right.
She argues that if we can't even agree on basic biological realities,
Yeah.
then we're in serious trouble as a society.
Yeah, it's like, what is truth anymore?
Right. It's like we're living in this post-truth world
Yeah.
where facts don't matter.
Yeah, feelings are more important than facts.
Feelings trump facts.
Yeah. And she's arguing that that's a dangerous path
It is a dangerous path.
to go down.
For sure.
So she's calling for a return to reason
Yes.
And common sense.
Common sense
Yeah.
in our public discourse.
Yes. And she wants us to be able to have open and honest conversation
Right.
about these difficult topics.
Even when we disagree.
Yeah, without resorting to...
Name calling.
Yeah, name calling.
Censorship.
Violence.
Yeah, all that stuff.
Yeah, all the bad stuff.
Okay, so after all of this,
Yeah.
what is Gabbard's ultimate message in For Love of Country?
Well, her message is one of hope.
Okay.
She believes that America can overcome these challenges,
Okay.
but it's going to require a fundamental shift in our values and priorities.
Okay, so it's not going to be easy.
No, it's not going to be easy.
But she thinks we can do it.
She does. She has faith in the American people.
That's good.
It is good. Yeah,
We need more of that.
we do.
So what does this fundamental shift look like?
Well, she wants us to rediscover our shared humanity,
Okay.
embrace the principles of freedom and responsibility,
Mm.
and work together to build a more just and equitable society.
Okay, and it all starts with asking ourselves,
What does love of country really mean?
in today's world,
Yeah,
that's the question she leaves us with.
it's a good question,
It is a good question.
and one that we should all be thinking about.
Absolutely.
So thanks for joining me on this deep dive into Tulsi Gabbard's For Love of Country.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been a fascinating conversation.
It has.
And I think it's a book that's sure to spark some interesting conversations,
Oh, absolutely.
whether you agree with her or not.
Right. She's a thought-provoking writer,
She is.
and she offers a unique perspective on the challenges facing our country.
So I encourage everyone to check it out
Yeah, give it a read.
and form your own opinions.
Absolutely.
So it sounds like she's saying we've kind of lost sight of what it means to be American.
Yeah, like we're so focused on our differences,
Right.
We've forgotten what unites us.
Like we're more divided than ever.
Exactly.
And she says we need to move beyond
The
this us versus them
us versus them, yeah.
mentality.
And rediscover our shared values.
Okay, but how do we do that?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
And she actually offers some concrete solutions.
Okay, I'm listening.
It all starts with her call for a new political movement.
A new political Okay, so what would that look like?
Well, she envisions a movement centered around love, respect, and hope.
Love, respect, and hope. That sounds pretty idealistic.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But she really belies in it.
Okay.
And she even invokes the Hawaiian concept of aloha.
Aloha, like the greeting.
Yeah, but it's more than just a greeting,
Okay.
She describes it as compassion,
Okay.
love, and understanding.
I like it.
It's a far cry from the divisive rhetoric.
Yeah, it's like the opposite
It is, yeah.
of what we hear from most politicians.
Exactly.
Okay, so what else does she call for besides this aloha movement?
Well, she talks about electing leaders
Mm-hmm.
who are committed to peace,
Peace. Okay.
strength,
Okay.
and prosperity.
Prosperity. Okay, so she's not against prosperity,
No, not at all.
but she defines it in a different way.
Yeah, it's not just about material wealth for her.
Okay. So what is it about?
It's about living a meaningful life,
Meaningful life. Okay.
contributing to something larger than yourself,
Okay.
and fostering strong connections with loved ones
Mm-hmm.
and your community.
So it's more like spiritual prosperity.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not about how much money you have.
Right, it's about how much you give back.
Yeah, I like that.
It's a much more holistic view of prosperity.
Yeah, and she also talks about her father's experience, right?
Yes, she talks about her father growing up as a Polynesian kid
Mm-hmm.
in the segregated South in the 1950s.
Oh, wow.
So you can imagine.
Yeah, that must have been tough,
Really tough.
especially back then.
Yeah, and she uses his story to highlight
Okay,
the enduring legacy of racism in America
okay,
and the importance of continuing to fight for justice and equality for all.
okay.
It's a reminder that the struggle for civil rights
Yeah.
is not a relic of the past,
Yeah.
but an ongoing challenge that requires our constant attention.
Right, we can't just say, oh, we solved racism.
Exactly. It's not that simple.
Yeah, it's more complicated than that.
Much more complicated.
And she also talks about her experience participating in the 50th anniversary commemoration of the Selma to Montgomery marches,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
where she walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge
Powerful.
alongside civil rights leaders like John Lewis.
That must have been an incredible
I
experience.
can't even imagine.
Yeah. Walking in the footsteps of those who fought for civil rights.
It's a powerful symbol, right?
It is. It's a symbol of courage
Courage, yeah.
and sacrifice.
Yeah, and it kind of challenges us
It does.
to continue their work.
In our own time.
Yeah, like what are we doing to fight for justice today?
Exactly. What's our contribution?
It's a good question.
Yeah. And she draws inspiration from the leaders of the civil rights movement
Mm-hmm.
who she believes embodied the true spirit of America.
Oh.
They fought for equality and justice,
Yeah.
not through violence or division,
Okay.
but through peaceful protest, love,
Yeah.
and a belief in the power of unity.
It's a powerful message,
It is.
especially in our current climate.
It's a message that we need to hear
We need to hear it, yeah.
more than ever.
Yeah, but she's also critical of what she sees as the distortion of the civil rights movement
Right.
by today's woke activists.
She argues that they're more focused on dividing people based on race and identity
Right.
than on uniting us around shared values.
So it's like they've kind of hijacked
Right.
the movement.
Hijack the movement for their own purpose.
Their own agenda.
And she sees this as a betrayal
The betrayal,
of the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.,
exactly.
who dreamed of a society
Yeah.
where people would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
Right. That was his dream.
And she's saying that we're moving further away from that dream.
She is. She believes that the woke ideology is actually perpetuating racism.
By focusing on differences rather than commonalities.
So it's like they're doing the opposite
They're doing the opposite of what they claim to be doing.
of what MLK wanted.
Exactly.
Wow. And she also takes issue with critical race theory,
Yeah, she's very critical of CRT.
which she sees as a divisive ideology.
Right. She believed that it's creating more animosity and resentment
Okay.
rather than promoting understanding and reconciliation.
So it's making things worse.
In her view, yes.
And she even calls out Robin DiAngelo.
Oh, yeah, the author of White Fragility.
Right, and she criticizes DiAngelo.
For promoting what she sees as a simplistic and reductionist view of race.
That demonizes white people.
And reinforces a culture of victimhood.
And this ties back to her point
Yeah.
about the rejection of objective truth.
Right. She argues that the woke ideology is based on a denial of reality
Okay.
and a belief that truth is subjective
Subjective, okay.
and can be manipulated to serve political agendas.
So it's like they're creating their own reality.
Exactly.
That's kind of scary.
It is scary because if there's no objective truth,
Yeah.
then anything goes.
Right, it's just chaos.
It's chaos. Yeah.
And she's calling for a return to reason.
Yes.
And common sense.
Common sense.
Yeah, like, let's just be reasonable here.
Let's have a conversation.
Let's talk about this.
Let's debate the issues
Without attacking each other.
without resorting to name calling.
Yeah, let's just be adults about it.
Exactly.
Okay, so after all this, what is Gabbard's ultimate message in For Love of Country?
Her message is ultimately one of hope.
Hope, okay.
She believes that America can overcome these challenges,
That's good.
but it's going to require a fundamental shift
Right.
in our values and priorities.
So we have to change our ways.
We have to change our ways, yeah.
But she thinks we can do it.
She does. She believes in the American spirit.
That's good to hear.
She believes that we have the capacity for greatness.
Okay, and it all starts with love of country.
Love of country, yeah.
Well, what does that mean?
That's the question she leaves us with.
It's a good question. And I think it's one that each of us has to answer for ourselves.
I agree.
So thanks for joining me on this deep dive into Tulsi Gabbard's For Love of Country.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been a fascinating conversation.
It has.
And I encourage everyone to check out the book,
Yeah, read it for yourself,
form your own opinions.
and let's have a conversation about it.
Let's keep the conversation going.
Absolutely.